بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه الطيبين الطاهرين. I start by the name of Allah. I praise Him and thank Him for the countless blessings that He granted us without being obligated to do so. And I humbly ask Allah Ta'ala to raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his kind family, and his great companions. Thereafter, dear brothers and sisters, insha'Allah, the lesson for today is going to be about the rules of dry purification, which is tayammum. And so the author said, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy upon him. If one is in a state of ritual impurity, that is the state of hadath, and one cannot physically find water within his belongings or with the people that are traveling with him, or in the distance within which he is required to search for it when he is not able to find that water physically. Or if he physically has water, for instance, but he needs this water for drinking. Or he has water, but he fears that he will be harmed upon using it, whether they feared death by using that water, or the impairment of a body part, or the prolonging of a period of illness, for instance, then in all of these cases, one performs the dry purification, which is tayammum. Now, it is a condition for the validity of one's tayammum to be performed after the time of the act of worship has entered. That is, the time of the worship that he wants to perform with this tayammum has entered, such as a prayer or circling around the Kaaba. So with the prayer, for instance, if he wished to perform the Dhuhr prayer, he would not be able to perform the tayammum for this prayer until after the time of Dhuhr has entered. And it is also a condition for the validity of tayammum to be after the filth that is not exempt, which is on a person's body, is removed. Okay, this type of filth must be removed before one can perform the dry purification, that is the tayammum. Because if someone were to perform the tayammum with filth on his body, then his tayammum would be invalid. It would not be acceptable. This is the case if there is enough water to remove the filth, for instance, but it is not enough for that and for the wudu. Otherwise, if the water was not enough for the removal of this filth, then some of the scholars said that the judgment of such a person is similar to the judgment of a person who has no water nor soil available to them. And such a person would pray the obligatory prayer as they are without purifying themselves in order to fulfill the obligation within its specified time. But they must make up this prayer once they have the means to perform the purification. Now, the tayammum is performed by using unmixed soil which is pure and is also dusty. And so, substances other than soil will not suffice, nor will soil that has been mixed with ashes or the like, for instance, with flour, nor soil that has been contaminated with filth, such as urine, or used in performing the tayammum before. So soil that has been already used to perform the tayammum cannot be used again. And the tayammum is performed by using this type of soil, by wiping one's face and wiping the hands and the forearms, including the elbows, in that order. So it is necessary to observe this order by wiping the face first, then the hands and the forearms, with a minimum of 2 strikes. Okay, 2 strikes upon the soil, which would be on the ground, for instance, by which one transfers the dust twice to the parts being wiped. And so 1 strike would not be enough. However, more than 2 is permissible. So what is meant is that we are striking and then we are wiping the face. This would be one strike. And then we would strike again, and then we would wipe the arms. This would be the second strike. And with this second strike, this is sufficient in performing the dry purification. This movement, this second movement, would be enough in order to have this act fulfilled. It is also required for the validity of one's tayammum to have the intention of making the obligatory prayer permissible, while transferring the dust and wiping the first part of the face. So this intention must exist within the heart from the time we begin transferring the soil up to the time in which we have wiped the first part of the face. This is the time that this intention must take place within. Now, the following is a section which will explain the prohibitions upon the person who is in the state of ritual impurity, and the woman who is in the state of menstruation or postpartum bleeding. So this section is divided into three categories. The first category is pertaining to the person who is in a state of minor ritual impurity. The second category is about the person who is in a state of janabah, or he is junub, and we will define what that means. The third category relates to the woman who is in her menstruation or in a state of postpartum bleeding. And so the author said, the person whose wudu is invalidated is prohibited from doing four things. Okay, so the person whose wudu would become invalid by one of those matters that we spoke about before, then this person would be in a state of minor ritual impurity. And so he is prohibited from doing four things. The first one is to pray, whether it is an obligatory prayer or an optional prayer or even the funeral prayer. The second is to circle around the Kaaba, whether it is an obligatory circling as the Muslims would do during the pilgrimage, or it is optional as the Muslims would do when they first reach Mecca. This is a recommended matter for the people who would first reach the holy city of Mecca, is to perform this circumambulation around the Kaaba, so to circle around the Kaaba within its respective conditions and requirements. The third thing is to hold the Quran, and the same judgment applies to what has some of the Quran written on it for the purpose of reading. So to hold this thing that has had some of the Quran written upon it for the sake of reading it, this is also something that is prohibited upon the person in a state of minor ritual impurity. Not to what has had some of the Quran written on it for the purpose of protection. Okay, so this is something that is different. Something which has had the part of the Quran written upon it for the sake of protection. For instance, the hirz that the Muslims would wear around their necks, or that the Sahaba used to attach to the clothing of their children when they were young. These type of things, they are not what we mean when we say that it is prohibited to carry or to hold what has some of the Quran written upon it for the sake of reading. Rather, this has some of the Quran written upon it for the sake of protection. And the fourth thing is to touch the Quran. Okay, we mentioned holding the Quran. Also, it is prohibited to touch the Quran. That is, to touch the papers of the Quran, or to touch its cover, or its margin, which is the empty part of the page that would surround the verses written on that page. However, the child who has reached the age of mental discrimination is allowed to hold the Quran and touch it without having the wudu, only for purposes of studying, not for any other purpose, such as carrying it for somebody else. His father asked him to bring him the Quran. This is not allowed. Also, it is unlawful for the person who is junub. Okay, now we're speaking about this person who is in a state of janabah, or he is junub. That is, he has emitted the spermal fluid, or he has had sexual intercourse. It is prohibited upon this person to do the four aforementioned matters, the four things that we just mentioned about the person who is in a state of minor ritual impurity. And also to do two other matters. The first is to recite the Quran with one's tongue to the point where one can hear themselves, even if only one letter out of the Quran. If they did so with the intention, while having the intention to recite the Quran, then this is something that is prohibited. It is something that is not allowed for them to do. And the second is to stay inside a mosque, or to go back and forth in and out of the mosque. Okay? We don't mean here the mere passing through, for instance, from the front door of the mosque to the back door. This is something else. This is not prohibited. It is also unlawful for a woman who is in the state of menstruation or postpartum bleeding to do any of the 6 matters that we mentioned in terms of the person who is in a state of minor ritual impurity, as well as the person who is in a state of janaba. So the woman who is in her menstruation or in her postpartum bleeding is prohibited from doing all of the matters that we have just mentioned, as well as 2 additional matters. The first is to fast before the stoppage of the bleeding. However, it is permissible after the bleeding stops, even if she starts fasting before performing the obligatory bath. So, if the bleeding were to have stopped, but she had yet to perform the obligatory bath, she would still be allowed to start fasting. Also, women are obligated to make up fasting the days that they have missed as a result of menstruation or the postpartum bleeding from Ramadan. And the second thing is for the wife to allow the husband to enjoy the area between the navel and the knees by either lustfully looking at her or touching her without a barrier. Neither of these things are allowed when she is in such a state. That is, before she has performed the obligatory bath, okay? Even if she allowed her husband to do this after the bleeding had stopped. And so here, she is prohibited from allowing her husband to do the things that we've just mentioned after the bleeding has stopped, but before she has performed the obligatory bath. She must perform the obligatory bath before she can allow her husband to do those aforementioned things. However, some of the scholars said that anything other than sexual intercourse is allowed. And now the following is a section which is about the removal of filth. Okay? Among the conditions for the validity of prayer is to be clear of filth in one's body, even inside of the mouth and the nose, and as well in one's clothing and their place of prayer. That is, the place that his body comes in contact with while he is praying. As well, one must be clear of filth within what they carry in the prayer, such as a bottle which would be containing filth, or a tissue that has filth which is not exempt on it. So, one cannot carry such things within their pockets. If the filth comes in contact with a person who is praying, or his body, or his clothing, or what they are carrying on their shoulders, for instance, then their prayer is invalidated, whether the filth is dry or moist, unless the filth is thrown away immediately by shaking off the dry filth that had fallen on one's body or on what one is wearing, or by immediately removing what is worn on one's shoulders without carrying it, whether the filth is dry or moist. Okay, so when it comes to removing what one is carrying on their shoulders after it has been contaminated with the filth, whether that is dry filth or wet filth, one, if he was able to, removes this thing immediately but without carrying it. So one would not carry this thing to remove it. Rather, one must remove it without carrying it. And so if one was able to throw that filth away in such a manner, then their prayer is not invalidated. Or unless it is an exempted filth, such as the blood of one's own wound, one's prayer in this case is not invalidated either. It is also an obligation to remove the filth that is not exempt for one's prayer to be valid. It is also an obligation within the removal of filth that is not exempt to use purifying water to remove the entity of the filth and its attributes. That is, the taste, color, and smell of that filth. Because this is the only way to clean an area that has been contaminated with a non-exempted filth. As water is the tool of purification. But this is specific to the case where the filth has discernible characteristics, that is najasa ayniyah. However, in the case of filth that does not have any discernible characteristics, we cannot apparently see these characteristics, and this is najasa hukmiyah, which is when the color and the taste or the smell of the filth cannot be detected, such as urine that has dried and has no smell, taste, or color. And so the place that is contaminated with such a filth would be purified by pouring water over it one time, and this would be enough. The filth from a dog or a pig or from an animal that is a breed from both of these animals, from both the dog and the pig, or it is a breed from one of these animals, then this filth is removed by washing the contaminated area 7 times, one of which is mixed with purifying soil, okay? It is mixed with purifying soil until this water would become murky. And the water must reach every part of the contaminated area. The washing, which removes the physical presence of the filth, is deemed as one wash, even if it was numerous. What does this mean? This means that the wash which is needed to remove the entity of the filth and to remove the attributes as well, so the taste and the color and the smell, whether this is accomplished by one or by several washes, this removal is considered only one wash. Hence, there must be 6 more washes after this as needed. And in the case of using water that is a small amount, that is less than 2 qullas. Remember, we talked about this water that is a small amount. And if one was using this small amount of water in order to remove any type of filth, it is required to pour the water over the filth, because the filth itself will contaminate the small amount of water if it is placed inside that water. So if we were to fill up a bucket of water with a small amount, okay, here we would make sure to pour that water over the thing that is contaminated, and we are trying to remove that filth. We would not place the filth inside the bucket in order to wash this contaminated area. By doing so, we will have contaminated the water, and we would have contaminated every part of that object which has touched this water. However, putting filth in a large amount of water, which is 2 qullas or more, will not make the water filthy unless it changes. And so this goes back to what we mentioned in regards to that change occurring in the taste or the smell or the color of the water that is a large amount by coming in contact with filth. وَسُبْحَانَكَ اللَّهُمَّ وَبِحَمْدِكَ أَشْهَدُ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنْتَ أَسْتَغْفِرُكَ